Daniel chapter 6, and we'll pick up at verse number 10. That's what we covered, verse 10, and just that one verse last week. Daniel chapter 6, verse 10 says, "Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed, and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Then these men assembled, and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, The thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Then answered they and said before the king, That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition three times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is, that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. And we'll stop right there. So we are very familiar with what has happened here. You should be. We've been going through chapter 6 for several weeks now. And of course we know Darius has set over some princes, and over them 3 presidents, of which Daniel was one. And Darius was ready to make Daniel the second ruler, even over those, putting him above the other 2 presidents. And even though that he was a foreigner, that he was a Jew, that he was a captive, he still stood out to Darius as being someone who could rule and lead and do a really good job. And so to the king, he was very wise and honest and made him invaluable in service to the kingdom. But to the other presidents and princes, he was a problem. They were very envious of him and the position that he was earning, and him being an outsider just made it that much worse. And to them, Daniel had to go. And so they plotted and arranged a way to get that taken care of. Verse 4 tells us that then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find none occasion nor fault, for as much as he was faithful. They were unable to find any corruption in his conduct, and they decided to attack the one area that they knew Daniel would never compromise in, and that was his devotion to God. They convinced the king to sign a law forbidding prayer and making a request to anyone except Darius for 30 days. They were counting on Daniel to be loyal and faithful to God and not bend to the earthly laws of man. They knew Daniel pretty well, didn't they? Verse number 10 tells us that Daniel kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed as he had done aforetime. He was established prayer life, and we talked about that last week. Then as verse 11 begins here, the trap is sprung. Now that Daniel has prayed and they are ready to spring the trap on him, these conspirators gather outside Daniel's window evidently, and they were ready to catch him in the very act of praying. So it is here that we see the collision, if you would, of 2 kingdoms. That of the kingdom of man that requires conformity to its laws, and the kingdom of God that calls for conviction and standing on truth. Daniel's prayer life becomes the center of this battleground. Now Daniel has done nothing wrong. Nothing wrong, but in the eyes of the world, his obedience to God has become a crime. Obeying God has become a crime. Now, this moment teaches us a very important lesson, that sometimes doing right will make you look wrong in the eyes of men. Sometimes doing what is right will make you look wrong in the eyes of men. But it will always make you right in the eyes of God, which is much more important.
Amen.
Much more important. We as believers today face the same kind of testing. Though our lion's den will look much different, we live in a culture that increasingly pressures Christians to hide their faith, to silence their voices, to stamp out their prayers, to compromise on the truth, and to conform to what the world wants us to conform to. Daniel reminds us that true devotion to God doesn't bow to public opinion, or it does not obey an unholy legal decree. It bows only to God. Daniel's story is not about his defiance of the law of man for the sake of protest. That's not it at all. His story is about faithfulness to the truth. Our text, Daniel 6 and 11 through 15, reveals what faithfulness to God looks like when the world turns against it. And it is interesting and also very instructive that we see that Daniel did not fight back. He did not argue, but neither did he compromise. He simply remained faithful, and in doing so left us an example of courage that every generation can follow. So let's see if we can learn a few things from these verses here tonight. First of all, we'll look at the plot against Daniel coming to fruition here. The plot against Daniel in verses 11 and 12. These men, it says that they assembled and found Daniel praying. They waited for this very moment. They had set their trap, and now faithfulness has made Daniel their target. And the first lesson we see here is simply that faith will always be tested. True faith will always be tested. Daniel had stood before kings. He had interpreted dreams already. He had navigated his way through several changes of kings and governments even. But now his greatest test has come in that quiet place of prayer. God often allows His children to face circumstances that expose whether their faith is merely out of convenience and benefit, or if it's truly consistent and conviction. What a difference. Having faith of convenience or faith that is a conviction. Faith that is a conviction is going to get tested. Abraham was tested when he was commanded to offer Isaac, the promised son, as an offering and take the life of his son. Job was tested in his faith when he was stripped of all of his possessions. Daniel as well here was tested when he was commanded to stop praying. And each test revealed the depth of their faith. And God's going to do that. God's purpose for putting us through a trial of faith or this testing is never meant to hurt and harm you, but it is meant to simply prove you and strengthen your faith. When your faith is tested by pressure, criticism, loss, remember that God is refining you for greater usefulness. That's what He wants to do. He wants to use you in a bigger and better way. And He has to refine your faith in order to do so. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse number 7 says that the trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth. Notice that phrase. The trial of your faith, being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. So Peter is telling the folks he's writing to there in 1 Peter chapter 1, the trial of your faith is much more valuable than all the gold that you could accumulate here. And when it says in verse 11, these men assembled and found Daniel praying, well, they didn't have to search very long. Daniel was exactly where he always was, doing exactly what he had always done. His enemies knew his habits very well because they had studied his life. They knew when and where he prayed. They couldn't accuse him of dishonesty or of corruption or of carelessness in his duties. So they targeted his devotion to God. What a remarkable testimony, right? The only fault they could find was that he was faithful to God.
Amen.
What kind of an accusation is that? We should be reminded that the world watches believers very closely.
Come on.
Not to imitate them, but often to accuse and discredit them. They watch many times of how we would respond to stressful situations. They watch how we speak about others. They watch how we live when no one else seems to be watching. What an honor it would be if the only accusation they could ever bring up against us is that our walk with God was very serious to us and we were faithful to the Word of God. Philippians chapter 2 verse 15 speaks about this. It says that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation. We all should live in a way that our integrity limits the enemy's ammunition against us. If the world examines your life tonight, what would it see? Will it see inconsistencies or would it see faithfulness? May they find us busy praying, reading, serving, walking with God. That's the kind of evidence they need to gather. Verse 12 here in our text says that these men had assembled and they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed the decree? Well, they knew he had. The accusers here are just springing the trap. They appeal to Daniel's pride, to Darius's pride, reminding him of his decree, knowing full well that the whole purpose of them getting that law passed was to ensnare Daniel. They present the situation as if Daniel were a rebel against the king's authority. Notice how they say it down in verse 13. He says that Daniel regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed. So they are slandering Daniel now, and they're taking some of the facts and they are really twisting them to start a narrative against Daniel. And it's amazing how people do that. You can't believe someone's take on a certain matter that happened. It's best to get all of the facts and speak to all of the people that are involved to know what was going on. And here, Daniel's actions was not in defiance of the king. He was just obeying God like he had always obeyed God. And he was standing for what was true and for what was right, just like he had always stood for what was true and what was right. But here we have someone who's ready to get rid of Daniel. And so they are going to take these facts and they are going to use this and twist what he has done. Even though technically it's against the law, they're going to use that to get rid of him. They present that out there. What they said was really a lie because Daniel had served the king very faithfully for years. And his so-called disobedience was not rebellion but righteousness. Now, this exposes one of the most consistent and timeless truths when it deals with spiritual conflict. The world and carnal Christians will always misinterpret spiritual conviction as rebellion and opposition. The world and carnal Christians will always misinterpret spiritual conviction in someone as being rebellion and opposition. When a believer refuses to bow to ungodly culture, or to compromise with sin, or to hide their devotion to Christ, they will be accused of being disloyal, of arrogance, of narrow-mindedness, or of defiance. We have to note here that Daniel's loyalty to God did not make him disloyal to the king. It made him the most loyal man in the empire. He did not set out to defy the king, but to simply obey God. And his action was not political, it was spiritual. Daniel displayed the spirit of biblical obedience, conviction without hostility. Faithfulness to God does not require us to be hostile to men who oppose us. We can be very respectful to ungodly authority while remaining obedient to the higher law of God. Acts chapter 5, verse 29 says, we ought to obey God rather than man. So, here we see this plot, this trap has been set for Daniel. And now they are springing the trap with the king because Daniel has prayed, they have proof of it, and they have faced the king and tried to malign Daniel. And we see that the plot and trap has been set. Daniel's enemies gathered their evidence and presented their case to the king. And the king now faces a great dilemma between the letter of the law that has been signed and the life of his most trusted and devoted servant. That leads us to the second part of this, and that is the pressure on the king. So now they really put the pressure on him. Verse 13, let's look at it. It says, then answered they and said before the king that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah, regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Now, this was not just a neutral statement. It was loaded up with a lot of prejudice and malice toward Daniel. They wanted to remind the king that Daniel was a foreigner and a Jew, someone who didn't belong there in the first place, in their way of thinking. Their accusation paints Daniel as disloyal to the king and the kingdom. He regardeth not thee, O king. And that was false, of course. Daniel had served loyally through multiple kings and empires. But to envious men who are on the attack, truth doesn't matter when jealousy rules the heart. Truth doesn't matter when jealousy rules the heart. Their intent was not justice and truth, it was destruction and getting Daniel put away. The faithful believer will often be falsely accused, not for doing wrong, but for doing what's right many times. Joseph was accused by Potiphar's wife. He stood up and did what was right, but he was falsely accused. Elijah was accused by Ahab. Remember when it didn't rain for 3 years? And he finally went to Ahab and told him. Ahab saw Elijah and called him a man who troubleth Israel. And Elijah rebuked him right back and said, no, the reason Israel is troubled is because of you and your sin. And so Elijah was accused by Ahab of troubling Israel. Even Jesus, who we know did no wrong, was accused of blasphemy. and he was tried and convicted. Matthew chapter 5 verse 11 says, "Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake." Whenever you stand up for truth, we should not expect the world's applause. They're not going to cheer us on. We should expect accusation. But we can remember that God always knows the truth. And truth will ultimately prevail. It always does. Verse 14, in our text, Daniel 6, verse 14, it says, "Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself." Darius immediately realized that he had been manipulated. The lights came on. His eyes were open to what was going on. His pride had been a major factor in his blindness to what was happening. His signature was used to entrap his most faithful servant. The Bible does not say that the king was angry at Daniel. It doesn't even say that he was angry with the conspirators against Daniel. But it says he was displeased with himself. Can you imagine? That sounds a lot like conviction, doesn't it? Of, oh man, I have been foolish and I have done something very wrong. When a believer compromises a conviction or truth, regret always follows. Anytime you compromise on the truth, regret always follows. I can't help but think of churches around who are making small compromises. They are going to regret it one day. And it continues a path in the wrong direction, doesn't it? And it's true of our lives as well. If we start in the habit of making a small compromise on truth, it's going to come back up again. And we are going to face a day in which we regret ever making those compromises. So, when a believer compromises a conviction or truth, it doesn't matter why you compromise, whether it's for popularity or whether it's just out of convenience. Maybe there's personal gain involved in this, or you think that there is, or it may be like Daniel was facing here, some really strong pressure in their life even being threatened. That's pretty strong pressure. And so whatever the reason you compromise, it does not matter. God's able to take care of all of those things. What He's trying to find out is, are you going to stand for what's right? Are you going to do right? Are you going to stand for truth? That's what He wants to know. Darius's pride led him to make a law that seemed very flattering, but one act of self-exaltation nearly destroyed his most trusted servant Daniel. Pride always opens the door for the enemy to work. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Proverbs 16:18. When making decisions under pressure, especially moral ones or spiritual ones, you better take some time to really seek God's wisdom before you sign your name to anything like the king did here, because it will lead to regret. Verse 14 goes on to say that the king had set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to do that. So evidently there was the course of this day that the king had to try to figure out a way to get Daniel out of this and himself out of this. But yet here we see a powerful man in a powerful position all of a sudden become powerless. Darius had the authority of an empire, but he was bound by his own law. The Medo-Persian system of government prided itself on the unchangeable nature of its laws and decrees. Once written, even the king could not change it. So Darius labored. We don't know what all he did, but it says he labored. I mean, he put some work into this. I guess he sought every legal loophole that he possibly could, every possible way that he could save Daniel, but he could not find a single way in which he could help Daniel. The law he made now condemned the man that he loved and respected most. Some lessons we can learn from this experience with the king is that leaders need humility. If this man had been humble to begin with, he would have not been blinded to what was going on. In fact, the higher the position you hold, the greater the need for humility. Pride always blinds you to the enemy's traps and makes you very susceptible to flattery. These guys, the flatterers, knew that Darius was proud and their flattery would work. They knew exactly what words would stroke the king's ego because they had been around him some. And spiritual discernment is lost when pride rules in the heart of a man. Flattery is so very dangerous. You need to be very wary of people who try to appeal to your ego and not your conscience. Be very, very careful. We also see another lesson here that good intentions can't undo bad decisions. Good intentions cannot undo bad decisions. Darius labored to deliver Daniel, but it was too late. Nothing could stop the consequences of the decisions that Darius had made. The only hope that remains now is for divine intervention to overrule his mistake. And that leads us to the third part of this lesson tonight, and that is the patience to endure. The patience to endure. At this stage of the story, Daniel knows what the outcome is going to be. The law has been signed, the trap has been sprung, and even the king's sympathy could not save him. All Daniel can do right now is to wait patiently and quietly, trusting that God knows what's going on, that God sees what's going on, and that God will act in His time and according to His will. That's called patience. Verse 15. It says, "Then these men assembled unto the king." This was after he had tried all day to find a loophole. So it's coming down to the setting of the sun. This verse is almost implied that that's when Daniel's going to have to be thrown into the lion's den, at the setting of the sun. And so it is there at that time, these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, "Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king established may be changed." This verse reveals to us, it's silence through there of Daniel, it reveals to us an overlooked side of faith, and that is the patience to endure when nothing seems to be happening. It requires great faith in order to do that. The conspirators returned there at sundown to remind the king that the law could not be changed. It was their way of sealing Daniel's fate. But we notice that what is missing here is any argument from Daniel himself. There's no protest, there's no plea, there's simply a silence there. He endures it. And that silence from Daniel speaks volumes. It shows confidence that God is in control and there is no need to panic. He wasn't jumping up and down. It's amazing. Jesus, when he was falsely accused before Pilate, Mark 15 says that he answered nothing. You know, when you get falsely accused, you want to deny it and defend yourself. A natural response. Isaiah prophesied that Christ would do this in Isaiah 53:7. It says, He was oppressed and He was afflicted, yet He opened not His mouth. Patience in the face of injustice is one of the strongest evidences of genuine faith. When you cannot choose or change your circumstances, you can still choose your response. Daniel's response was calm confidence in God's control. When the world was busy scheming, he remained still. Psalm 37:7 says, Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for Him. Faith is not only about bold actions like praying with your windows open back in verse 10, but it is also about quiet endurance in verse 15. Faith often begins in prayer, but it is proven in our patience. Daniel's courage to pray was very remarkable, but his composure before the king's decree is equally powerful. He shows no bitterness, no panic, and no complaint. He simply trusts that God will have the last word. Faith that will not wait is not really faith. If we can only trust God when we see quick results, we are trusting outcomes, not the Lord. Not the Lord. Hebrews 10:36. Hebrew people that were being written to were under great persecution. They're going through a great trial of faith. Hebrews 10:36, the writer says, For ye have need of patience, that after ye have done the will of God, ye might receive the promise. In verse 15, it looks like Daniel's fate is sealed. The law can't be changed and the lion's den awaits him. But from heaven's perspective, the story is not even halfway over yet. Man's final word is never final when God's involved. I think of Abraham, waiting and waiting and waiting for Isaac to be born. I think of Joseph, who had to wait through the pit, through Potiphar's house, through prison. He'd been given a promise of ruling, and here he is in prison for years, waiting it out. I think of David, who was anointed king as a young man, but then he fled for his life for many years from King Saul, hiding in caves and waiting there. All of these men are men of great faith, but before God would use them, He had to prove their faith. And God required all of them to exhibit great patience, a trial of their faith. God often waits until the last possible moment, doesn't He? Not to come through, not to torment us, but to prove us, to teach us that deliverance is entirely His doing. David penned the words, Psalm 40 and verse 1, I waited patiently for the Lord, and He inclined unto me and heard my cry. When you feel like you're stuck in situations in life and there's nothing you can do to fix it, a problem that you can't change, a person that you can't convince, a pressure that you can't get out from under, we should always remember Daniel 6:15 and how he acted. Even when everything seemed settled and stacked against him, he believed that God was not finished yet. And because Daniel endured faithfully without panic and anger or even compromise, he became a living testimony to everyone around him. Even the king noticed and spoke about his composure and his integrity. Down in verse number 20, the King Darius, he called him the servant of the living God, whom thou servest continually. That continually included this very difficult moment of waiting for God to come through. Faith that stands and fights is a strong faith. But faith that can wait is even stronger. James 1:4 says, "But let patience have her perfect work, that ye may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing." A couple of lessons we can draw from Daniel's patience here is that patience is not weakness, but rather strength under control. Anyone can panic in a situation, but only faith can wait. The time we spend waiting is not wasted time either. God is making us wait for a reason. God was busy preparing the king's heart and working in his life. He was preparing the stage set for a great deliverance, and he was even preparing probably the lions in the den, getting them ready for what was about to happen. Another lesson is that when we stand still and let God fight for us, He receives the glory and not us. And that's what we want. Here's an important one. Peace in the midst of pressure like Daniel was experiencing. Peace in the midst of that pressure came from his faith and trust, not from understanding what was going on. Peace in the midst of pressure comes from trust and not understanding. Daniel did not know how God would deliver him. He only knew that God would deliver him. From the mouth of the lions or from this world. And he was leaving it in God's hands. But he had a peace. So verse 15 closes the human side of the story. Daniel's patience under pressure. He can't do anything about it but wait. And he does so with peace. Now the scene begins to shift from Daniel's patience to God's power. When man's law could not be changed and the king's hands were tied, God himself stepped into the show and proved that he alone rules in the kingdoms of men once again. He's going to do that. And we're going to study about that and look at that a little closer next week. But there's a lot of great lessons and truths in these few verses here about Daniel's faithfulness in the fire. No, he didn't face the fiery furnace, but this was a fire for sure. And we better heed those lessons that are there. All right, let's pray.